Well, let's start the hour with a new UN report that claims that at least 232 civilians were killed in attacks by the South Sudanese government between April and May. Now, about 120 women and girls were also raped and even gang raped in opposition-held villages. 3 SPLA commanders suspected of bearing the greatest responsibility in the violence in Unity State were also mentioned in that report. According to the report, the attacks were aimed at driving out opposition forces. There was no immediate reaction to the report from the Juba government. Speaking on Tuesday, the UNHCR spokeswoman condemned the atrocities which left hundreds displaced.
Victims and witnesses describe how the SPLA and aligned forces would storm into villages in the early morning around dawn, surround the village and start shooting at fleeing civilians. The attackers would then steal cattle, loot entire households, and burn down houses and food stocks. Civilians were targeted, with the elderly, people with disabilities, and very young children killed in horrific acts of violence. Some hung from trees, and others burned alive in their own homes.
Well, a damning report indeed. Let's get the very latest now from the United Nations headquarters. We're joined by our correspondent, Nick Harper in New York. Nick, of course, this report comes just hours before the Security Council is due to meet and decide on whether to impose sanctions on South Sudan. Is this report likely to have any bearing on this decision?
Well, considering the chilling details which are in this report, it is likely to be front and centre of the Security Council's minds when they meet on South Sudan. Now, they're scheduled to meet on Thursday. The idea of this is to renew the current sanctions regime that is in place against South Sudan, and to also re-adopt the mission mandate for the Sanctions Committee's panel of experts. But they have been weighing up the possibility of imposing additional sanctions as well. They originally imposed a deadline of June the 30th. They said that if the conflict didn't end by then, they would add more sanctions. We had the peace deal in time for that deadline, but of course the ceasefire hasn't quite come to fruition. So there is the possibility that they will add additional measures. And up until now, they've been weighing a travel ban and asset freezes against 6 high-profile members of the government and the opposition, including the country's defence minister and the former army chief. Considering the timing of this report, it is something that they will have to weigh very carefully when they meet on Thursday. There have been council members wanting to push ahead with extra sanctions, but there have been other members, including some of the African nations on the council, who have been cautioning that immediate response and have been asking for more time. But potentially after this report, now might be the moment when they meet on Thursday, when they decide that enough is enough and more sanctions are needed.
Indeed, and of course we know that the United Nations has invested considerable resources in trying to secure peace in South Sudan. Have we had any reaction to this report just in the corridors of the UN headquarters so far?
Well, from the headquarters here in New York, no real response yet. The UN Secretary General is away travelling. We haven't had any statement directly from him. The UN Security Council will probably in some way, shape or form put out a statement. They haven't yet done that. But in terms of the UN base in Geneva, where the Human Rights Office is based, some of the language coming out of there, the statements and this accompanying report have been particularly damning. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zayed Rad al-Hussein, saying that the perpetrators must be held accountable, that these were horrific crimes, they were revolting acts, and also saying that it does seem that they were deliberate, ruthless and brutally violent attacks, particularly against women and children, and therefore may amount to war crimes. So some very strong language being used by the Human Rights Office, but the Security Council not yet reacting to the news.
And Nick, the report goes as far as to identify specific individuals who may face war crimes charges. Are we likely to see the UNHCR push for such prosecutions in this already volatile country?
Yeah, these 3 commanders being identified in the report, the UN saying that they bear the greatest responsibilities. Zayed Rad al-Hussein once again saying that there must be consequences. So yes, the UNHCR, the UN Security Council as well are likely to want to push for prosecutions. But remember, it's notoriously difficult to secure those, especially in countries where conflicts are ongoing. The United Nations does not hold any jurisdiction in South Sudan or any other countries when it comes to prosecutions. They can only make the recommendations for the South Sudanese government to act. There hasn't been any response from the Juba government yet, whether or not they will go ahead with that. But Zayed Rad Al Hussein, when he announced the findings of this report, also once again reiterating calls for a hybrid court to be set up, something that would happen between the South Sudanese government and the African Union. Hussein thinks that this would be a way of potentially bringing those perpetrators to justice. So they're pushing for it. But of course, the outcome of actually getting people who can be held accountable is always very, very slim in these sort of circumstances.
We've seen that before, certainly. Nick Harper, thank you so much joining us there live from New York. Now, earlier we spoke by phone to South Sudan's government spokesperson, Ateni Wek Ateni, about the response to this damning report. Let's take a listen.
First of all, we take such report seriously as a responsible government. Should the information about the abuse of human rights and sexual abuses comes to us, we take it very seriously. However, in this case, we have not been informed as government about any abuse that has taken place, and there's no any report that indicates, certain part of the army has taken law into their own hands. That will, will make us to wonder as to why such report was released in the first place, when in actual fact the information has not been shared, was not shared with the government, so that the government looked into where and how and who are the culprits. Those who are actually looking for government of South Sudan to be sanctioned are the one behind such reports. There are a number of people who have taken up on themselves, decisions not to look at what is positive in South Sudan. Only what is negative is what they try to bang on, because without anything negative, their job will be worthless completely. This is the policy of the government that, peace must prevail in South Sudan. The intransigency is within the rebel group. So if the African Union wanted to continue to punish even those who have accepted peace like government, then that will be a biased decision, because the government of South Sudan needed, to be supported, because, in order to do enough.
On a more positive